Good afternoon. As usual, I have the pleasure to invite you to another Viking lecture, today in English, because we have a very special guest. He is a lecturer in Old English and Old Norse at University College Cork. His research interests include runology, Old English and Old Norse literature and mythology, early medieval textualities, and reception of medieval literature and culture. And today he will shed some light on certain aspects of that reception in the works of one of the most famous fantasy writers. I have the honor to invite you to the lecture on Tolkien's Invented Runes by Dr. Toma Birketta. Welcome, Tom. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation, Renata, and it's a real privilege to be able to talk to you today about a topic that's of great personal interest to me as well as academic interest. So I'm going to talk today about Tolkien's invented runic systems, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the runic script, which some of you will know very well already, the historical runic script, that is, and then I'll talk a little bit about how Tolkien's runes Tolkien adapted his runic system and how that's fed into later cultural productions, including the film versions of his work. This was a runic inscription that fell into my inbox not too long ago, sent by a colleague, and it was unearthed in St. John the Baptist Church in Chester. The colleague of mine wanted help deciphering what the runes said, so he could tell that information to his student. And I had a look at it, and it became very quickly apparent that this wasn't a medieval inscription at all, which would have been possible based on the location of the inscription. But it was written, of course, in one of Tolkien's runic alphabets, the Angurthas. Once we discovered that, it became quite clear that the first part of this inscription read "my brother" in Tolkien's runes. So it was clearly a memorial to somebody which had been written in their memory. Now, Tolkien's runes are cropping up all over the place. Of course, we're introduced to them generally in Tolkien's children's book, The Hobbit, and they feature fairly prominently, as we'll see, in The Lord of the Rings as well. The runes in Chester, the grave runes, are one of many modern applications of Tolkien's runic script. There are inscriptions engraved by Tolkien's fans as far away as Sydney Harbour National Park. There are Tolkien souvenirs and movie props with inscriptions in Cirth, as well as countless tattoos, fan art featuring his runes, sometimes drawing on the classic HarperCollins versions of his novels. There are even several fonts that can be used to write your own runic inscription. So more striking still is the impact which Tolkien's runes have had on the medieval fantasy genre in general, in which runes generally serve as kind of central fantasy motif. The popularity of Tolkien's fiction and the prominence of his invented runes were at least in part responsible for the New Age revival in the use of runes for fortune telling, divination, and for self-counseling, as one successful series has recently put it. So these attempts to make money from the credulous, I suppose, would have horrified the scholar in Tolkien, I think. But the popular association between runes, magic, and fortune telling is also part of his legacy in the 21st century. As Paul Noland Hyde, who's done, or back in the 80s and early 90s, did a lot of the work on the scholarly investigation of Tolkien's alphabets. He's written that Tolkien recreated the runic system so that it seemed to many to be more believable than the original. And his Cirth represent, I think, an academic fiction that's to some degree obscured a really fascinating, if underappreciated, historical tradition. So we'll start with the historical tradition and we'll work towards Tolkien's invented alphabets. as a lot of you will already know, the early runic tradition is somewhat obscure. It was the runic system was inspired by an existing alphabet, probably the Latin alphabet, although there's some debate about that. Certainly, the order of letters in this derived alphabet is unique. So the first letters being F, U, the thorn symbol TH, A, R, K, and for that reason we've referred to it as the futhark rather than the alphabet. This early script was used across a wide geographical area with some surprising consistency, really, considering that it was written as far apart as Ukraine on the one hand and the Low Countries on the other. And it was used to record several different languages. The oldest period of runic writing is defined by short inscriptions, by limited uses. So it wasn't, as far as we know, used for administration or record keeping. And there are lots of examples of pseudo-literacy, including nonsense inscriptions, which I think were a little too readily interpreted as magical inscriptions in the early years of runology. More typical, I think, of the early inscriptions is perhaps this comb, which for a long time was considered the earliest runic inscription, and it bears the name Harja, which is probably a personal name written onto the bone of that comb. So it was an ordinary script which could be used to express language in written form, but it also probably had some associations with cultic use, perhaps, and was probably used as all writing systems were on occasion for writing operative inscriptions. The runes may have been named from a very early date. They may have been given proper names, a little bit like the Greek alphabet. That's something that's not present, of course, in the Latin alphabet. And it was probably also divided into 3 sets or families from an early date. And that's important because this is something that Tolkien appears to replicate later in his invented alphabets. It was important for the original writers of runes because it allowed them to write using a kind of cryptographic system where they could indicate the position of the rune numerically rather than writing the rune out itself. And that's something that we find in the later manuscript tradition. So this is a runestone that appeared fairly recently and has, or at least has been fairly recently published. And this just goes to show, I think, how little we know really about the earliest runic tradition and how one new find can really blow the whole field open. So this is a runestone which was discovered not too far from Oslo and has been interpreted by scholars in the University of Oslo, by runologists. And it's an inscription that was found in a context where they could date it to between 0 and 250 AD. So it has the potential to be the oldest inscription, and it's certainly the oldest runestone inscription. And it was found in Norway, so quite a long way from where many of the theories of the origins of runes place that in the kind of border between the Roman world and Germanic tribes in the southern Denmark or even in northern Germany, whereas this is much further north in Scandinavia, in Norway. It may also record a female name. That's one of the interpretations that that scholars in the University of Oslo have given, that it means for Idibera. So there's a lot that we still don't know about the early runic tradition, and new finds like this are really changing our understanding fairly rapidly as well. There was a theory that would have been well known to Tolkien that runes were derived for writing on wood, and that it's for this reason that horizontal lines are avoided because they blend in with the grain of a piece of wood like pine. And you can see that quite clearly here. I think that theory is perhaps Perhaps there's a little bit of doubt about that now. A lot of the medieval inscriptions have curves in them, and there's no particular reason, I think, for avoiding curves in an inscription on wood. Certainly not in an inscription on metal or bone. But that was a theory that was certainly known to Tolkien, as we'll see, that also played into his invented runic scripts. Now, the later developments in the history of runic writing, the system of rune writing came to England with Germanic tribes migrating from the continent to the east of England, first of all. And there was a time when we talk about Anglo-Frisian runes because it's very hard to distinguish between runes that may have been written on the continent in the Low Countries and brought over to the eastern coast of England, and inscriptions that were written in England itself. But certainly that tradition established itself in England and took on quite a different character before too long. The script was reformed and expanded in the 7th century, and that reform probably took place within the auspices of the early medieval church in England. So it was a fairly systematic reform which allowed the script to be used to write, to represent the sounds in early English. Around the same time, it was reduced from 24 to 16 characters in Scandinavia. Again, no one is really sure why that happened, although it did coincide, again, with the transition from Proto-Scandinavian to Old Norse. There are several variants of Viking Age runes, and they're probably the ones that are known most widely, including the fantastic rune stones of southern Sweden in particular. There were further innovations in the runic tradition in Scandinavia in the medieval period, and including an expansion again of the alphabet. And there's also a manuscript record of runes, both in England, on the continent, and in medieval Iceland. And those manuscript traditions tell us quite a lot that we wouldn't know from looking at the corpus of inscriptions themselves, including the names of the runes, which are recorded in Anglo-Saxon England, in Iceland, and in Norway. The runic script continued in use in parts of Sweden until the 1500s, and it was kind of began to be studied as an academic discipline around 100 years later. So runology, as this very brief overview has probably shown you already, runology is, or could be, characterized as a discipline of gaps, and we are kind of filling in those gaps gradually. But there is still quite a lot of uncertainty about the origins of the runic writing system, and there'll probably be debate about that for the next 500 years, I'd say. There's a lot of uncertainty about the reason for the futhark order. Why did the people who invented this alphabet or adapted it from an existing alphabet, why did they see the need to change the order of the letters? Was there some kind of particular meaning in that order that they gave it? Was it just to distinguish it from other writing systems? There's uncertainty about why it was reduced from 24 to 16 letters in the Viking Age, as I said. And there's a lot of uncertainty about the interpretation of individual inscriptions as well, particularly older futhark inscriptions, which, as I said, there's a lot that are simply uninterpretable, at least linguistically. They don't make any sense. There's also, and perhaps this is not quite as big a gap, but there is some clear distinction between how Old Norse literature represents the runic tradition and how the practice tradition seems to have played out. So it's not clear whether there's any reality being reflected in the Eddic representations of runes, for example, in medieval Icelandic literature, or the representation of how runes are used in the sagas of Icelanders as well, seem to be quite different, although there are a few overlaps, quite different to the practice tradition. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think in Tolkien's time, certainly in the early mid-20th century, there was a lot more uncertainty as well. Runic scholarship has come on greatly as a kind of scientific discipline, particularly in the last 10, 20 years. And it's really been established as a discipline with clear ways of representing runic inscriptions, with a lot less imaginative interpretation of inscriptions, and a lot less recourse to magic when we don't know quite what things mean. So if we move on to Tolkien now, and to talking about how he adapted the script, well, the first place people will usually come across Tolkien's runes are in the Hobbit. And in fact, these runes are not really invented runes, they're repurposed runes, but they are in fact the English runic system, the Anglo-Saxon runic letters. And Tolkien uses them to write modern English, which of course in itself is something that's a bit anachronistic, but he generally sticks to the conventions for the representation of runes in the practice tradition. So he includes, I don't know if you can see there, but he includes a point, a punctus between, as a word division between words. He sometimes avoids doubling letters, although not always. And he generally uses the correct characters to represent the phonemes in modern English. So the runes on the cover of this classic HarperCollins cover of The Hobbit really act as a kind of gateway, I think, to enter into Tolkien's fantasy world. So they're very evocative, and alongside, of course, the mythical landscape there, the forest, the dragon in the sky, I think they really draw you into that fantasy world. And a lot of what comes after really is based on that same idea, I think, of the runes as a gateway to fantasy. And I think they're still used. If we look at a lot of the Tolkien imitators in the present day, and a lot of them using rune in the title to indicate that this is medieval high fantasy, a lot of them incorporating runes into the cover art, because again, it is that kind of key that shows you what genre you're dealing with, that shows that that's a relationship with Tolkien, and that kind of draws you into his work. So the conceit that Tolkien is using here is that he's using a historical script known to few people, he says, and this is an approximation of the runes that are found in Middle-earth. And this is the inscription that people come across on the frontispiece to The Hobbit. The Hobbit, or There and Back Again, of course. But he remarks in a letter to his publisher, Allen and Unwin, that Anglo-Saxon runes were, quote, regretfully substituted to avoid abstruseness for the genuine alphabets. And by genuine here, what he means is his invented Angurthas, his invented runic scripts, which he'd already started working on at the time of publishing The Hobbit. The historical use of runes in or the use of historical runes, I should say, in The Hobbit seems therefore to have been some kind of compromise on Tolkien's part. And it may have made the philologists in Tolkien a bit uneasy, I think, to be using genuine English runes here. In his cover art and in his author's preface, Tolkien sticks very closely to the rune forms, as I've said, and follows various conventions, including the punctus that you can see here. Within the novel itself, he primarily represents the runes as a script of communication, with some of the internal references, such as the engraving of swords, the sword names Goblin Cleaver and Foe Hammer, in runes following historical uses of the script as well. We know that in England they were used on various parts of swords, and in the Scandinavian tradition on various other weapon parts. When he was borrowing English runes wholesale, Tolkien perhaps felt compelled to represent the kinds of inscription he found in the runic corpus, and not to stray too far from the practice runic tradition. But he does introduce the notion of runes that are powerful above and beyond their representation of spoken language as well. So in addition to the riddle-like runes on Thror's map, which he asks in the introduction, he asks the reader, or challenges the reader, to interpret those runes by using a translation later in the work as a crib. So to go back and look at the map using the translation that Elrond gives of the runes as a crib, to work out what this inscription means on the map. Later on, we learn that there are also moon runes or moon letters, which Elrond explains can only be viewed with moonlight shining behind, and with the more cunning sort, can only be viewed with a moon of the same shape and season as the day on which they were written. And you can see here in this little bit of merchandise you can buy after the Hobbit films. You can buy a kind of UV moon runes reader here to reveal the moon runes whenever you like. Now, it's a bit of a jump from runes written in what amounts to a kind of invisible ink, really, to runes that are powerful or operative in and of themselves, magical in and of themselves. But it does give a hint that there's something more than ordinary about the runes as it's manifested in Middle-earth. And this is a hint that will be developed by Tolkien in his later work. But also Tolkien distances himself from this conception of runes as being magic as well, as we'll see. Something that his imitators certainly didn't do. So when we come to Lord of the Rings, and I'm afraid my slides have gone a bit awry here, but when we come, this is the edition of the Lord of the Rings. It's the 1993 HarperCollins edition that I first read or had read to me as a child by my dad. Again, we have the runes here as a border, as a kind of gateway to the work itself, and we can see inside the work as well. We have Tolkien's Cirth along the top. Now, at this point, Tolkien has moved away from using English runes or Anglo-Saxon runes to using his own invented runic alphabet, the Cirth. And he'd also freed himself, therefore, from the need to represent a historical tradition as well. Tolkien's Cirth were quite closely based on historical runic alphabets. Although he states emphatically in a letter to an inquiring reader that his invented Cirth, quote, have no supposed historical connection at all with the Germanic runic alphabet, they're an independent creation related to historical runes only in their form. But Tolkien was notoriously guarded about his influences and sources for Middle-earth, as I'm sure any of you who've read anything about any of Tolkien's letters will know. In his essay on fairy stories, he makes his dislike of the reconstruction of sources for his fantasy very clear. And he famously exclaimed of a supposed connection to Wagner's Ring cycle that, quote, both rings were round and there the resemblance ceases. But despite his protestations to the contrary, it's clear that the legendary history of Tolkien's runic system does map onto his invented alphabets quite clearly. So first of all, the Cirth, which I've represented here, and when I refer to Cirth, I'm referring to his invented runes. That was the word he used for this writing system, which was devised for engraving into wood. And when I talk about the Angurthas, I'm talking about a particular runic alphabet or a particular rune row, of which there are several, and we'll see. So he talks about in the notes that Christopher Tolkien put together for the Treason of Isengard, he talks about the so-called alphabet of Daeron, the Angurthas Daeron, was in origin a runic script devised for inscriptions, especially on wood. So here already he's mirroring that idea that runes, the form of runes came about because they were devised for scratching onto wood, so they avoided horizontal lines, and they're very angular. And he suggests that the similarity between his invented runes and historical runes is, and this is in another letter, that it's inevitable for a script devised primarily for cutting or scratching on wood. So he dismisses the connections between the historical runes and his own invented alphabets by saying, well, if you set out to devise a writing system for use on wood, what you'd end up with is essentially characters that look like this. Okay, so he kind of dismisses that connection between the two, the historical and invented traditions. Now, Paul Noland Hyde, who I mentioned earlier in this paper, did a great service by looking through all of Tolkien's runic characters, or all his Cirth, and documenting whether they accorded with a historical runic letter, or whether they were invented, or whether they were a variation on a runic letter. So a variation being, for example, an original runic letter, a historical runic letter that's been reversed in Tolkien's. And we can see that number 21 there is a reversed version of a historical rune. And when he did that, he came out with the number that of these 58 or so runes, around 40 of them are identical or reversals of the historical letters. So at a level of form, there's clearly quite a lot of borrowing from the historical runic tradition. He also originally probably intended for the runes to be listed as particular sequences, and we can also map that onto the origin, to the division of the older futhark into families, or etir, into sets, which I mentioned were used for the writing of ciphers in the historical tradition. I've put together a little table here just to show how the history of his Cirth map onto historical runes. And we can see that in the case of the historical tradition, Roman or the alphabetic writing systems are older, runes are the younger derived tradition. In Tolkien's invented script, the Tengwa is an older writing system, and the Cirth, devised for writing on wood, is the younger system. But he, in his mythology of the scripts, Cirth are an independent creation that aren't derived from Tengwa. I've mentioned the correspondence between the engraving into wood theory for origins. But interestingly, in the case of historical runes, as we've seen, there are contrasting theories about when and from which system the runes were derived. And Tolkien also introduces that discourse, I suppose, or that discussion about where they come from. There are contrasting theories of origin. He says they're attributed to the Sindar of Doriath, but they're probably should be attributed to the Danian elves, who ultimately come from the Noldorian stock. So there are contrasting theories of origins even within his legendarium. The earliest inscriptions in the historical tradition are brief, laconic, mainly consist of personal names or brief memorials. And Tolkien, in the appendix to Lord of the Rings, states that the Cirth were long used only for inscribing names and brief memorials on wood and stone. So again, we have that correspondence between history and invented alphabet. Runes were used across Northwest Europe and for different languages. And in Tolkien's runic systems, Cirth spread to men and dwarves and were used for different languages and adapted accordingly. Originally, in the historical runic tradition, there was a one-to-one sound correspondence, one letter to one sound. And in Tolkien, there is a logical ordering, which is later debased in use by men's and dwarves. So there's a similar idea that that system was degraded over time. So there are lots of correspondences at the level of history, and that sharing out of the runes between dwarves and men and even orcs, in fact, This is paralleled also in the Norse mythology about the origins of the runic script, where the god Odin, through a gory self-sacrifice, receives knowledge of the runes, and we're later told that that knowledge is then shared out to different beings in the world, dwarves, elves, and so on. So Tolkien's history is according to, with both the historical runic tradition and with myths about the historical runic tradition as well. Now, this is the earliest Cirth system in which the assignment of values was unsystematic, Tolkien tells us. And this is perhaps best thought of as Tolkien's Elder Futhark or Older Futhark script. So from this comes a much more elaborate, more linguistically sophisticated series of rune rows, which are known collectively as the Angurthas. Now, Tolkien, as we know, was very interested in perfecting the medieval. And I think we can see a little bit of his nationalistic tendencies coming in here. He claimed in one of his letters that the English gave runic writing its most elaborate development, which I don't think we can really claim with any scholarly basis. They said there was certainly a reform of the script, but it wasn't the most elaborate development at all. Cirth was reformed, so his invented runic script was reformed after a period of decline and debasement by the minstrel scholar Daeron to create the Angurthas Daeron, the most perfect example of the script. And I think we maybe see here a little bit of the kind of scholarly fantasy here. Tolkien, the minstrel scholar, is perhaps a proxy for Tolkien himself, developing the runic script according to sound linguistic principles and perfecting, as I said, the earlier attempts at runes. The reform of the historical runic alphabet in England was spurred by sound changes in Anglo-Frisian and under the influence of the Roman script. So, as I said, it was probably reformed in the English Church. And certainly by individuals who were literate in the Roman tradition. The reform in Tolkien's invented scripts is spurred by the need to represent languages other than Sindarin, and it's reformed under the influence of Tengwar. And the reform by this minstrel scholar is based on sound linguistic principles as well, so taking the reform a step further. The traditional division of the futhark into sets, as I said, used for ciphers, is also replicated in Tolkien's invented alphabets. So Tolkien's Angurthas Daeron, so this most systematized reform of the script, is a featural system, and by that that simply means that the features of the letters correspond with the sound that the letter represents. So to give you an example here, when there's usually a branch to the right, but when you reverse the direction of the branch and make it go to the left, it indicates the opening to a spirant. So here we've got T in number 8 there in the list, and when that's reversed, it becomes the of this. Okay. When you double the branch in the example number 9, you add voice. And then there are other featural rules as well. So doubling the branch of a vowel indicates a longer vowel. So there we've got the rune number 46 being a shorty, and the rune below being a long version of that same letter. And you can see here on the Wikipedia page, they've again arranged these letters into sets, and you can see how they are a lot more, they're arranged according to linguistic principles in a way that's just not present in the historical tradition. So this is Tolkien working on the runic script as a linguist and perfecting it, essentially, making it featural and making it what it could have been, I suppose, in his eyes. Okay. Now, Hyde has also written about some runes that don't appear in either the appendices to the Lord of the Rings or in the Treason of Isengard, the notes there. And these are the Gondolinic runes, which are surviving on a scrap of paper, which Hyde got his hands on. And he points out that this runic system, the arrangement is not according to the Angerthus Deiron, nor does it depend on the Tengwa, and the deviser clearly had perfect symmetry in mind. So Tolkien never got around to publishing this, but he probably had an even more systematized and symmetrical system based on even sounder linguistic principles in mind as he was developing his scripts. Now, I said that there's no example in the historical tradition of the kind of application of clear linguistic features. But in the medieval tradition, the Scandinavian medieval tradition, we do have dotted runes where the voice is added by adding a dot, and the I and E vowels are also distinguished by a dot, and I've represented both of those in that inscription. You can see also the B and the P. So there we've got two dots inside the loops of the B to indicate voice again. So this is the closest, I suppose, the runic tradition got to that kind of featural system where certain linguistic features were represented using written signs. Now, in Tolkien's invented alphabets, we also have a book form of runes. We have, as I mentioned, manuscripts recording the runic tradition. We also have a full manuscript, the Codex Runicus, which is a book of law from Denmark from around 1300s. And we have a snippet of another manuscript written in runes. But this doesn't seem to have been a tradition that really gained any traction, and nothing became of it really. This is really a one-off. Tolkien took his cue from that probably, and he also developed mentions a book script. So certain of the older forms of the runes are lost, but they are recorded, or the inscriptions are lost, but they are recorded in books, which is how the minstrel scholar Dairon gets his hand on the runic, on the Cirth, and is able to perfect the script himself. Now, this idea of perfecting the medieval is really a common theme in Tolkien's fiction. And we could look at his improvement of the runic script as similar to the modifying of Anglo-Saxon warfare through Rohan's use of horses, and a lot has been written about his playing out of the fantasies of what it might have been if the English had a tradition of fighting on horseback at the time of the Norman conquest. He, of course, completed the lost lays of the poetic Edda in his Legend of Sigurd and Guthrun, slightly bizarre poems which were published with some of his notes on the Edda fairly recently. And the creation of Smaug to correct the disappointing conversation between Sigurd and the dragon Fafnir in the Eddic tradition, where Fafnir asks him some questions about mythology and where he's from, and it's a very disappointing exchange. So Tolkien really liked to write into the gaps, as Shippey has written extensively about, and he also liked to perfect the sources that came down to him. So what do we make of runes as they appear within the world of Middle-earth? Well, really they appear in a similar way to the writing of runes on the cover. They represent in Lord of the Rings a kind of medieval detailing. So we get this cover art, which suggests that there's going to be a lot about runes in the book. We get an appendix dealing with the Cirth quite extensively. But then they play a really minor role within the text itself. Most of the time, runes appear in ways that wouldn't set them far apart from the historical tradition either. Engravings on weapons, Gandalf's fireworks being marked with his rune, presumably his initial. Also, the box that's given by Galadriel to Sam has her rune on the front as well. There's the writing of a memorial inscription in Moria, And there's also the Book of Marzibil, as I said, which has a historical precedent. Here are the runes from Balin's tomb, written in the Angurthus Moria, so an adaptation by the dwarves of the Angurthus Deiron, to adapting it to their language, and degrading some of those linguistic principles in the process that Deiron had set up. And as I said, the Book of Marzibil, which Tolkien seemingly intended or requested to publish in Lord of the Rings, but it was rejected by the publisher and was later published, or these fragments from the Book of Marzibil were published in Pictures by J.R.R. Tolkien in 1979. So I think now at this point it's worth turning to look at the historical context in which Tolkien was writing, just to finish up or round up this presentation, I suppose. So somewhat counterintuitively, what we see in Lord of the Rings, as well as in his notes on Cirth in the Treason of Isengard, which Christopher Tolkien dates to around the same time as the writing of his trilogy, is both a fleshing out of Tolkien's runic system and also a movement away from the kinds of magical associations that we see in The Hobbit, towards a scholarly reconstruction of a plausible history that in its central details really maps onto the historical runic tradition. So at the very moment that he fully realizes his fantasy script, we also see a retreat from the more fantastical elements of runes and their associations with magic. And this is where I think it's productive to consider the development of Tolkien's runic systems against the wider historical context in which he was writing. Now, Tolkien was, of course, as I mentioned earlier, reluctant to acknowledge the influence of contemporary events on his fiction. And I think it's right we should avoid reading his fiction as an allegory for the defeat of fascism or the horrors of mechanized war. But I think we are probably justified in reading his use of Norse source material, including the runes, particularly the runes, as a response to the same appropriation of this material in 1930s Germany. In a letter to his son, Michael Tolkien, he declared quite famously his burning private grudge against that ruddy little ignoramus Hitler for ruining, perverting, misapplying, and making forever accursed that noble northern spirit that I have ever loved. And you can feel Tolkien's anger here, personal anger against Hitler for the appropriation or the misappropriation in 1930s Germany of Scandinavian culture, of Old Norse literature, and of the runic tradition as well. In another letter to his son, later in the same letter to his son, he also, and this is less quoted, he also acknowledges the appeal of this Germanic ethos, including to his younger self. He says there's a great more force and truth than ignorant people imagine in the Germanic ideal. I was much attracted to it as an undergraduate. And he goes on to say, how now as a fully fledged scholar, he knows to reject this Nordic nonsense. Christine Chisholm characterizes this letter as crackling with, quote, the indignation of the territorial scholar. But the misuse of runes within the Third Reich was something that was very personal to Tolkien, I think. Old Norse Icelandic studies and runology in particular took a long time to recover from its association with Germanicism and with the Nazis. What did this Nordic nonsense consist of then that Tolkien is speaking about? Well, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there'd been an unhealthy interest in runes on the fringes of the Völkisch movement, which looked to folk art and culture as a source of the survival of supposed Germanic traditions that had been suppressed by Judeo-Christian influence and by the weight of the classical tradition in Southern Europe. This blood and soil ideology was linked to the idea that by recovering a glorious Germanic past, Germany could presage a new golden age of hegemony. And runes came to play an important role in this complex of ideas, with the racial mystic pictured here, Guido von List, suggesting that the ancestors had encoded secrets and lore in the runes, which could be tapped into by those sharing an Aryan life force. He devised a system of 18 runes, which are pictured here, with mystical associations, which were based entirely on his own imagination and which included his own invented symbols. Despite having no historical basis to this system, it was enthusiastically embraced and reworked in 1930s Germany as the Völkisch movement evolved into Nazism. Himmler's personal mystical advisor, Karl Maria Willigut, was responsible for runes being integrated into the iconography of the SS in particular. And this same mystical mumbo-jumbo informed the use of powerful runes on, for example, Himmler's personal gift, the Totenkopf ring. The runic nonsense was taken even further by other racial mystics, including Friedrich Marby, who invented a kind of runic yoga, which is pictured here, where I think the idea was that you made your body into shapes which resemble the runes, and by doing so you could kind of channel Aryan energies, tap into this kind of great spirit of the Aryan nation. There was also a form of runic humming and yodeling and singing, and this was apparently too much for even the sanctioned occultist Willigut and Himmler. And Marby and another of his Aryan mystics found themselves imprisoned, Marby in several concentration camps, for bringing Aryan heritage into disrepute with things like the runic yoga. Now, it's not clear how much Tolkien knew about runic gymnastics, but he was certainly aware of the Germanic pseudo-scholarship that underpinned these ideas, and including the popular idea in Germany at the time that runes were the original alphabet from which all others were descended. He was also keenly aware of the very prominent misuse of the runic tradition in Nazi iconography, the racial mysticism underpinning runic revivals in Germany, and also the representation of runes as magic letters in Wagner. It's tempting to read Tolkien's prominent use of historical English runes in The Hobbit as engaging in a cultural tug of war over the tradition in the pre-World War II years, and his prominent elaboration of an invented runic system in Lord of the Rings as a fantasy that's able to compete with the very prominent racial fantasies playing out in Hitler's Germany. Tolkien offers us a fantasy, but unlike the Nordic nonsense of Guido von List, it's a fantasy that knows itself. It knows that it's fantasy, whereas in 1930s Germany, this was being presented as scholarship, is being presented as fact. It's also a fantasy, though, that mirrors the historical tradition in key ways, that's based on sound linguistic principles, and that actually, as we've seen, divests itself of magical associations in The Lord of the Rings. I'm very persuaded by Christine Chisholm's argument in a fantastic article on myth and history in World War II, that what we see in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is essentially a long letting go of the dangerous allure of fantasy and a return to history through his work. Not in the narrow sense of Lord of the Rings representing an allegory for World War II or for mechanized warfare, but in the sense that his quest narrative is all about destroying the temptation of the ring, and with it precipitating the decline of the elves and the decline of magic. And with that decline, the decline of world creation as an artistic endeavor, along with what Chisholm calls the deft manipulation of sublimity practiced by National Socialist ideology. So by moving us away from magical associations with the script and consigning Middle-earth to history, with the elves departing to the Grey Havens, the world fading to grey with them. And I'm paraphrasing Chisholm again here. But this is particularly pertinent, this decline, I think, this return to history when it comes to his runic, invented runic tradition. I think Tolkien was very aware of the way imaginative uses of the script amongst the racial mystics of 1930s Germany had led to a very dark place. But I think he increasingly felt the need to counter this, but also perhaps felt increasingly uneasy about his own imaginative approach to the script lying on that same continuum, on that same spectrum as the Nordic nonsense he was seeing playing out amongst the Germanic fantasists in Germany. Ultimately, I think that is why we see a return to the broad parameters of the historical tradition, even as he finally has the canvas to fully flesh out his invented Cirth in his fictional history of Middle-earth. This is also about reining in his own attraction to the mystical northern spirit and avoiding the temptation to invest the runes with a power beyond their function as a writing system used for recording written language on durable materials. Now, unfortunately, the system that Tolkien derived was, to return to that quote at the start of this paper, for many more believable than the original, because he filled in the gaps, because he based his system on sound linguistic principles, because he overlaid it so closely on the historical tradition. It has at times threatened to cast a shadow over the source material, something I think Tolkien would have been horrified at. It's ironic as well, considering his return to using runes in historically plausible ways in The Lord of the Rings, that the fantasy genre that followed in his wake has taken quite a different trajectory and generally represents runes as magic symbols, powerful in and of themselves, and often having nothing to do with writing, which Tolkien never forgets in his fiction. So how are the runes used? Just to finish up, how are runes used in the films? Well, in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, they're used in very restrained ways. They're used to decorate swords, probably with a mind to prop replica sales. There's a reproduction of the Book of Marzabul in Moria. There are some references in the books which are not taken up. One of these is that the S rune, which was daubed on the heads of Saruman's private army. That's replaced by a white hand in the films, probably because of its association with the S runes of the SS, which was probably a connection that Tolkien wanted to point up in his fiction as this kind of deliberate countering of what he was seeing in 1930s Germany. We have, as I said, the Book of Marzabul, and we have then, when it comes to the Hobbit films, a slightly different use of runes. We have a lot more extensive use of the script, and that may be because, first of all, they're trying to get 3 films worth of material out of a short children's book. And so the kind of detailing that we find, including runes, plays a more prominent role. The first time we come across it, of course, is in the engraving of Gandalf's rune on the door, which is rather confusingly probably from Tolkien's Cirth. It's an F rune in the historical tradition, but it represents the sound G for Gandalf in Tolkien's invented alphabet. So even though in his children's book he was using English runes, we're seeing some Cirth, some of his invented runes coming in here in a slight slippage. We have that scene of Elrond reading the moon runes, but this is really elaborated upon, and he uses a kind of crystal rune reading platform, which is very kind of new age, to do this, and a lot is made out of it. So again, they're taking those cues. They're probably influenced by the representation of runes in the fantasy genre as being magical symbols, and they're really elaborating on that in the films. There's some material dealing with runes brought in from the appendices to Lord of the Rings, so I couldn't find a good still of this. So this is some artwork from DeviantArt, but Azog the Defiler carves runes onto the severed head of the Dwarf King, and we see that represented in the films as well. This is material that's taken from the appendices to the Lord of the Rings. We see invented inscriptions as well. We see runic tattoos on Dvalin, for example, and his axes are also have their names in runes engraved on them. Now, this is a historical tradition as well. Weapons did bear names in the older futhark tradition. But clearly this is something that doesn't come from Tolkien's lore. It's been elaborated upon for the films. Similarly, the key to Erebor has a runic inscription on it with a mind to prop replica sails again. And Killy's runestone, which again is a popular prop replica. And this plays a role within the plot, even though it's not a very convincing plot. Here, the rune, Killy's runestone, contains the inscription, "Return to me," and he tells us that it was given to him by his mother, and it's involved in the love story with the elf, the forbidden love story. So runes, this again is completely invented. It's not in Tolkien's fiction, and it's used to flesh out the world for the films. Another curious moment comes, runes are used extensively in decorating the dwarf kingdom. And here we have an inscription. "Herein lies the seventh kingdom of Durin's folk. If this fortress be lost or overthrown, look to the power of the Arkenstone." And very perceptive fans of the films have transcribed and interpreted this. And interestingly, in the film, when this is read out to Bilbo, a slightly different translation, which doesn't match up with what's written here, is given, which doesn't mention the Arkenstone. So there's something perhaps interesting going on there as well. Certainly a lot of work has gone into representing runes within this fictional world. So why are runes used so often on screen? And they also appear, we might say, in the Rings of Power series. Well, of course, expanding a short book, as I said, into 3 films requires elaboration. It's a way to add detailing, just as in the covers of the books. It's something strongly associated with Tolkien's fantasy world that draws you in. Playing to expectations set up by the genre of medieval high fantasy that Tolkien pretty much established. There's a growth in the marketing of prop replicas, and there's an increasing prominence of runes within the fantasy genre, and an increasing association of runes within popular culture, I think, with magic. And that's something that Tolkien perhaps bears a little bit of responsibility for as well. There are some runic clues in the Rings of Power, but I don't think we've got time to go into those right now. I'll just end, because I want to return us to history, really, to this fascinating history of runes, which has really been a little bit overshadowed at times, I think, by the popularity of Tolkien's invented inscriptions. But certainly when we discover new runic inscriptions, prominent inscriptions like this Vindalev Bracteate, they do generate a lot of interest amongst the general public. And this is a particularly interesting inscription because it has been interpreted by the Danish runologists who've been looking at this as having an inscription which might be the nickname of the individual depicted here, and the inscription "He is Odin's man," which would, because the Bracteate is dated to the early 5th century, would be a reference to Odin, which is older by at least a century, I think, from any other reference to the Norse god. So there's fascinating finds being made all the time in the historical runic tradition, and I hope that if anyone has been inspired to an interest in runes through Tolkien, that they always go back to the historical tradition I think that's what Tolkien ultimately would have wanted. And I'll leave it there on the 1 hour mark. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tom, for a very interesting paper. And now we have a question from our audience. Do we know how long did it take to create Cirth?
No, but I think he was working on Cirth from quite an early date. Certainly at the time that The Hobbit was published, he already had notes and was developing his script systems as well as Tengwa. So I don't think we know how long it took to create Cirth. I think his history of the script took him his whole life because he was still probably tweaking it in his notes, and he didn't come back to write about it. But certainly, I don't think Tolkien ever put anything down and left it. He was always picking it up and fiddling, and I don't think I can give you a better answer than that. Really, I don't think we have any indication, that he how long it took him to invent the first version of that script. But as I said, he was probably doing it over a long period of time.
Thank you. And another question. Did Tolkien know Bard's script invented by Edward Williams? It seems a little bit similar to some of his letters.
That's a good question, and I really don't know the answer to that. Maybe the questioner could give a bit more information. I haven't heard of that invented script. Okay, and it seems that we've run out of questions from our audience for now. Of course, we encourage you all to ask some questions, but now I have a question too, because I think it's a privilege of the host to ask some question. You were talking about Tolkien's runic legacy in Peter Jackson's movie trilogy, or trilogies, to be more correct. But I wonder if there is something like Tolkien's legacy that goes beyond the Middle-earth. I mean, do you know of any fantasy writer or video games creator who invented his own runic script, going in the footsteps of Tolkien, and maybe being more inspired by Tolkien himself than by genuine Germanic runes? Oh, that's a very good question. I think we certainly see the influence of Tolkien in video games, and they don't. There aren't inventions really of wholesale inventions of invented runic scripts like Tolkien's, but there are borrowings of the kinds of ways that Tolkien uses runes. The God of War is a very good example, where they're using Elder Futhark runes, and they're using it to write Old Norse, which isn't quite accurate, but and they're also using it in ways that seem to have been inspired by Tolkien's fiction. A lot of engraving on weapons, a lot of runic inscriptions on portals, and lots of long runic inscriptions, which we don't have from the older corpus. But in terms of wholesale invention, I think where you probably do see that is in the kind of New Age, neo-pagan use of runes for fortune telling and for divination and that kind of thing. There, I think there's always a bit of Tolkien coming into their imaginative reconstruction of what the runes mean, and the fact that they might have certain powers associated with them, that they might be able to tell you something about your future. And often, I mean, one of the most popular writers in that genre, who sold over 2 million books, I think, says that they had no knowledge of the historical tradition when they invented their runic kind of fortune-telling system. But I bet what they did have knowledge of was Tolkien's invented runes, and that probably played into their interpretation. So I think that happens a lot, and obviously that's a tradition that's going back to that kind of Nordic nonsense I was talking about. in in the early 20th century. And in fact, although many kind of New Age uses of runes wouldn't have that that kind of racial aspect to them, they may not even realize that they're part of that legacy. It does ultimately go back to that tradition of racial mystics, essentially trying to tap into a spirit energy that they thought was associated with the runes. And Tolkien, although he was countering that, I think he's also been an inspiration for people who are continuing that legacy in a kind of indirect way. But again, I think he'd be horrified by those kinds of uses of his invented alphabet. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. As for the runic nonsense, I was really fascinated by runic gymnastics that you showed us. An incredible thing. I didn't even know that something like that existed.
Yeah, it's really Heather O'Donoghue, who some of you will know from. She's written a lot about Old Norse mythology and also about the reception of Norse myth. And she wrote a really good article about that tradition and about the kind of all kinds of things, runic dance and yodeling and all these different ways. Which, I mean, like, your first reaction is to laugh at it, right? Because it's really, but this kind of thing is still practiced, you know. And there are quite a lot of apologists for this kind of thing. There are still runic gymnastic guides on the internet. If you don't have to search very far, you know that there are still people peddling this kind of thing. And again, they've tried to, or they say that they've removed the racist element to it, but it's still ridiculous, you know, the idea that you can, and it's inspired also, I suppose, by there was a huge mishmash of influences as well in the late 19th century, you know, of different practices from the East as well, you know, and combining it with Eastern religions and I think some of this nonsense didn't have a racial element. It just increasingly became so in towards the end of the 19th century in Germany, and continues as a kind of nonsense tradition today as well. Yeah.
I have also another question, probably slightly more difficult. As you said, Germanic runes were considered to have some supernatural background, at least in the Scandinavian tradition where the god Odin himself was involved. And I wonder why there is nothing like that in Tolkien's works. Do you have any idea why that divine factor is missing?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it's to do with that return to history as well. You know, that Tolkien, he was much more interested in the script, in perfecting the script as a linguist, and in sticking to the idea that runes were simply an alphabet used for writing languages, you know, and an alphabet that never gained its full potential, I suppose. But it is curious that he doesn't weave in that very prominent myth in the Norse tradition of Odin's finding of the runes. He doesn't weave that into his narrative. These are well, they're not human inventions, but they're inventions of the elves. They're not something that are passed down to humans by the divine. And I think that was probably deliberate. You know, I think Tolkien probably wanted to get away from that association of runes with the gods, which again would have been going a little bit against the kind of even against scholarly interpretations in the 1930s. You know, that there was a lot more scholars, including runologists, who were willing to read the runes as being magical, as being associated with the gods, whenever there was no prosaic meaning, you know. And I think that was something that Tolkien probably didn't have a lot of time for, to be honest. So there's this perverse thing that he's making runes into this kind of fantasy script, but at the same time he's kind of resisting a lot of those contemporary scholarly misinterpretations or interpretations that were of their time, but that were too readily drawn towards magic. So there's a real kind of contradiction there, I think.
Thank you very much, Tom, for your paper. It was really fascinating to get into the process of Tolkien's invention of the runes. And I think it's very important to show it because, on the other hand, Tolkien's Germanic inspirations are something that is commonly known. And that he used Germanic runes is quite obvious. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, if you go deeper into the process, as you did, you can see that there are many layers of it, and they are not that obvious. So I think it was very interesting to see this development, this creation of Tolkien's runes. And thank you very much for that and for showing it in such an interesting way.
Well, thanks again for the invitation. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, I'm happy to answer them by email. So. Mm-hmm. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you once more. And I would also like to thank all our audience for participating. And I would like to remind you that our lectures are being recorded and they are still available after the transmission. So if you were fascinated by Dr. Birketta's paper, as I was, you can rewatch it at any time and go back to it, for example, on YouTube. So thank you once more, Tom, and thank you all for attending our meeting. Have a nice evening, probably with some Tolkien reading. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.